Hi ELC family and friends. Thanks so much for tuning in to another Sunday evening book club. I'm very excited to have you here with me. As you can see, I'm all by myself this evening. Mrs. Johnson was unable to be with me tonight while we were reading. And I'm in a very special location. I'm in Mrs. Varakakis's tiny town. This is where she has a lot of her small groups during the school day. She just read a wonderful book, Skeleton Cat, for our picture book. So if you'd like to see that, check out our other video. So she said that I could stay and enjoy this space to read our chapter book. I'm going to be reading chapters 8, 9, and 10 of our Sleepy Hollow book this evening. Just to let everyone know, we're really looking forward to this upcoming week. We're going to be having our PBIS school assembly and PBIS whole school party. So hopefully everybody's been getting their wolf dollars in, and maybe your name will be drawn for our big party this week. All right, let's dive back into our book. Last we checked on Ichabod, he had just gone to the Van Tassel's estate, and he was noticing how lovely it was, with lots of food and animals and beautiful furniture and beautiful decorations in the house. And he was deciding that he was going to try and figure out a way to make sure he lived in that farmhouse. So let's check back in with Ichabod. Chapter 8, The Rival. Before long, Ichabod had planned to court and woo Katrina. Court and woo, right, are some fancy words to say he was trying to figure out a way to marry Katrina. Since he was already her singing teacher, she already knew him. And like most of the girls, she found him to be quite interesting. You see, most of the young men who lived in Sleepy Hollow were farmers' sons. They were gruff and awkward country bumpkins. Compared to these young men, Ichabod was a gentleman. And perhaps more importantly, he was a learned gentleman. He had read several books thoroughly and was, of course, an expert on Colton's History of New England Witchcraft. On top of being the schoolmaster, Ichabod was also the choir director, which was a highly esteemed position in the church. Often after church on Sundays, the young people of the congregation would gather around Ichabod. They would stroll together along the banks of the nearby mill pond. Or, for their amusements, Ichabod would read out loud to them. Many of these were sweet young girls who were very pretty and kind. But after seeing the Van Tassel farm, Ichabod was only interested in Katrina. So he began to court her in his earnest. Now the knights and the princes of earlier times only had to battle giants and dragons, but Ichabod had a really serious obstacle to overcome. Katrina was also being courted by the most popular Dutchman in Tarrytown, Broom van Brunt. Unlike Ichabod, Broom was handsome. He had broad shoulders and curly black hair. His sturdy frame and brute strength had earned him the nickname Broom Bones, which was what everyone called him. Broom Bones was an expert horseback rider. He was also always one to settle the disputes among the men, and no one ever disputed him. Broom was constantly playing practical jokes and stirring up fun. If anything, Broom's crazy behavior made him even more popular. After all, he always had a colorful story to tell. But some people wondered that if he only appeared to be popular because no one ever went against him. Broom also traveled with 4 or 5 equally tough and manly companions. They looked up to him and did whatever he wanted. The noisy bunch could often be heard whooping and hollering as they rode home late in the evenings. Villagers would remark that when they heard him pass, "There goes Broom's bones." While some said that the attention that Broom paid to Katrina was quite gruff, he was not, after all, a gentleman. Rumor had it that she did not discourage him, and his horse, Daredevil, was often seen tied to the Van Tassel fence posts in the evenings. Because of Broom, most of the men of Tarrytown gave up all hope of winning Katrina. Surely Broom Bones would lead her to the altar. Ichabod, though, did not give up. He was not silly enough to approach Katrina in front of Broom, of course, but he, under the guise of being her singing teacher, would often visit her at the farmhouse. Luckily for Ichabod, Katrina's parents did not stand in his way. His father doted on his only child. He always let her have her way. So if she were to choose Ichabod, or anyone for that matter, they would be fine with it. Katrina's mother, for her part, was very busy running the house and managing her huge collection of fowl and poultry. Besides, she reasoned, girls could take care of themselves. It was the chickens that needed looking after. So while Katrina's father sat on the front porch and her mother busy about the house, Ichabod had Katrina all to himself. Together they would take long walks across the field or sit by the side of the spring under the giant elm tree. Soon after Ichabod began making his advances, Broom Bones stopped coming to the Van Tassels. Ichabod was delighted by this. But before long, a kind of feud erupted between Ichabod and the very popular Dutchman. Broom would have fought Ichabod openly and with his fists. Ichabod, of course, knew quite well that Broom would win such a fight, so he always decided to fight the battles in other ways. Namely, he avoided Broom at all costs, and he wisely went near Katrina only when he knew Broom was nowhere around. This system worked quite well for Ichabod, but there was a catch. Ichabod became the brunt of Broom's practical jokes and mischievings. There was always the time Broom and his men broke into the schoolhouse and turned everything topsy-turvy. The place was such a mess that Ichabod thought witches were holding their meetings in his own schoolhouse. Worse, Broom made Ichabod look like a fool in front of Katrina. He trained a stray dog to whine and howl whenever Ichabod tried to teach Katrina a new psalm. The dog was so loud that neither Katrina nor Ichabod could hear anything else. And then there was the night that Broom and his gang followed Ichabod home after he'd been visiting Katrina. Ichabod was strolling happily through the woods, barely noticing that night was upon him when the sound of galloping hooves suddenly surrounded him. Terrified, Ichabod began to run, but soon stopped in his tracks. A towering black steed was standing in his path. A moment later, a large orange pumpkin sailed through the air, smashing into the ground just a few inches from Ichabod's feet. Ichabod stood rooted to the path, frozen with fear. It was not until he heard Broom's rumbling laughter that he had the courage to continue on his way home. Even so, he looked over his shoulder more than once before he got to the farmhouse where he was staying. Some of Brooms' pranks were terrifying. If Ichabod hadn't been dead set on marrying Katrina, he might have given up out of fear. But he was determined, and he seemed to be winning the lady over. If things kept going his way, he'd soon have Katrina's heart and hand, and the vast Van Tassel farm. Well, I love how persistent Ichabod is being, and determined, right? He's not giving up. Chapter 9, An Invitation. One warm autumn afternoon, Ichabod sat in his schoolroom while his students worked away at their seats. The room was quiet, and soft afternoon light filtered through the window. Ichabod's desk was full of items he had recently taken from his previously students. A half-munched apple, 2 whirliwigs, a flying cage, and several paper animals. Ichabod was thinking about the fate of his relationship with Katrina when a clattering of hooves caught his attention. A burly man on a wild-looking colt raced up to the schoolhouse, jumping up and down, and tied his horse to the rail. A moment later, the messenger came thundering into the schoolhouse. While the students looked up in surprise, interruptions at the schoolhouse were very rare. Ichabod hurried to the door to see what the man was after. The man grinned and handed Ichabod an invitation. It was not just any invitation either, but one to a quill at the farmhouse of none other than Mr. Van Tassel. Ichabod was filled with glee, and the rest of the afternoon the schoolhouse was full of bustle and hubbub. The students hurried through their lessons. Books were flung aside without being put neatly back on the shelves. Inkstains were turned over. Benches were knocked down and not picked up. And the entire class was let out an hour early. The students tore out of the schoolhouse with excitement. The whoops and hollers echoed across the hollow as they ran and jumped into the autumn sun. I tell you what, I don't care where I am going, but I would never leave my classroom like that. No way. With the schoolhouse finally empty, Ichabod took his time getting ready for the party. Using a small piece of broken glass that hung in the back of the room as a mirror, he spent a very long time primping and preening. He brushed and shined his best black suit, and he combed his hair this way and that, and he straightened his ties at least 6 times. And when he finally was satisfied with his reflection, he set off to the farm where he was staying. He had a strong feeling that tonight would be an important night with Katrina, and he wanted to borrow a horse to make a very good impression. Hans Van Ripper, the owner of the farm where Ichabod was staying, was so happy to oblige the schoolmaster. So Ichabod set forth, riding a horse, to the Van Tassel farm. To be honest, it must be told that animal Ichabod rode was actually an ancient, broken-down plow horse. He was gaunt and shaggy, and he had a skinny neck with a thick head. His mane and tail were tangled and matted with burrs. One eye was closed, and the other was remarkably lean. Gunpowder, as the horse was called, had once been a favorite of his master's, and as Van Rip was faster and furious rider, it was thought that he had given his horse some of his own spirit, for as old as Gunpowder was, he still had a spark about him. Ichabod was a good match for the funny-looking steed, for he too looked odd. He rode with very short stirrups, which brought his knees clear up to his chest. His bony elbows stuck out like grasshopper legs, and as Gunpowder jogged along, Ichabod's arm flapped like a pair of wings, and the skirts of his back coat fluttered back and forth, practically as the horse's mane did as well. Ichabod thought himself quite gaunt as he rode along the trail to Katrina's house. But together with Gunpowder, he was quite a strange sight, not very unlike some of the ghosts who wandered Sleepy Hollow in the dead of the night. Chapter 10. Feasting. After a lovely ride through the colorful countryside, Ichabod arrived at the Van Tassel estate. It was mobbed by the people of Tarrytown, who had come to celebrate autumn. The farmers were dressed in their homespun coats and pants and wore polished pewter buckles. The farmers' wives wore ruffled hats and long-waisted dresses with scissors and pincushions hanging on their sides. The young women were dressed like their mothers, but sported straw hats or fine ribbons in their hair. And the young men wore short coats with a round, shiny brass buttons. Brom Bones was the hero of the party. He arrived on his horse Daredevil, a horse so wild and mischievous that he alone calls a sir. And of course Brom was dressed in his best. As Ichabod made his way to the farmhouse, he spied a group of girls already gathering around Brom. Once inside, though, Ichabod forgot all about Brom Bones. His eyes were caught by not only Katrina, by the amazing beauty of her face, and by the amount of bounty on the buffet table. His eyes bugged out at the very sight of it, and his mouth began to water. The table was covered with platters of every food imaginable. There were all kinds of Dutch tea cakes, donuts, and crispy and crumbly crawlers, sweet cakes, shortcakes, ginger cakes, and honey cakes. Mixed in with the cake platters were all kinds of pies, sliced ham and roast beef, and dishes with peaches and pears, broiled beets and roasted chickens, and bowls of milk and cream. Standing tall among it all was a giant teapot that sent up the most beautiful smelling vapors. Ichabod had worked up quite an appetite during his ride to the farm, and now he hastily made his way to the table and began to eat. He ate, and ate, and ate, and sampled everything that was on the buffet. Good food always made Ichabod happy, and as he looked around, he could not help but think that someday all of this would be his. Ichabod licked his fingers at the end of his delicious meal and felt wonderful indeed. Just then the sound of music ebbed through the front hall, and Ichabod gleefully made his way to the common room. It was time to dance. What many people didn't know about Ichabod Crane was that he prided himself on his dancing as much as his singing. He was a wonderful dancer. When the music played, all of the physical awkwardness disappeared. Every part of his body moved to the music. Katrina was Ichabod's dance partner, and as he glided gracefully across the floor, she smiled at his compliments and complimented his dance moves. Indeed, the schoolmaster had the envy of every young lad in the room, especially Brom, who sat sulking by himself in the corner. As Ichabod gazed at Katrina on the dance floor that night, he was sure that he had died and gone to heaven, but that was yet to come. Oh my, I can't wait. What a great cliffhanger to leave for us on this evening. Hope you've enjoyed it. We'll see you tomorrow at school. Have a great evening. Thanks.